morning. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you all for your ongoing support. For those of you who are new to the Council and Town Hall, we are a nonprofit 501c3 with the mission of informing our members and audiences about the most compelling international, national, and regional issues. We are a nonpartisan organization. An important part of our programs is that we enable our audiences to ask questions of the speakers to foster a more engaged discussion. When the COVID hit us all in early March, we too pivoted from our usual in-person programs to these live streams. Since then, we have produced over 60 live streams reaching more than 35,000 viewers across the United States. Our in-person programs were a key source of our revenues in the past. Today, we're offering these live streams for free as a public service, which is why we need your support to be able to continue to produce these quality programs. So if you would do me a favor and just give us a minute at the end of this program so that you can find out how you can support us by becoming a member, by making donations, and registering for our programs. We can't do this without you, and you can make a huge difference. Thank you so much. It is now my great pleasure to introduce today's program, a conversation with Dr. Fiona Hill, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. She will be speaking about foreign interference in the 2020 election. Today's program is moderated by Robert Abernethy, Chairman of the American Standard Development Company. Bob is a proud member of our board of directors, and he's also proud of the fact that he has been a member of the World Affairs Council and Town Hall for over 50 years. So we are so appreciative of his ongoing dedication and advocacy for our organization. For those of you who would like to submit questions, we'll be taking them in about 20 minutes. There's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, and she'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible. So without further ado, Dr. Hill and Bob, it's time to bring you on. We are so looking forward to today's discussion, and we so appreciate your time with us today. Hi, Dr. Hill. Hi, Bob. Thank you, Bob. I'll turn this over to you. Thank you,
Kim,
Dr.
Kim, thank you very much for the wonderful work you've been doing to lead the council forward. And I just want to emphasize the words that you spoke earlier. There is a wonderful set of programs and information for all of you who are watching this program, both members and non-members, to partake of. And I would recommend you go to our website and just look at the smorgasbord and choose the things that you'd be interested in for you. Kim has done a fantastic job in leading the staff to produce this smorgasbord of ideas for you. Fiona, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon or this morning, depending on what time zone you're in. You've made an immense contribution to the United States. You're a Russian expert. You're a Putin expert. Very knowledgeable about all of Europe, but particularly about Eastern Europe. You've served as a Deputy Assistant to the President of the United States, Senior Director of Europe and Russia, and Officer of the National Security Council in the White House. And you've been an important witness in the House impeachment hearings recently. But I would like to have you talk a little bit about how you got your start in life and how that led to what I've just described. You were from Bishop Auckland, and I wish you would touch a little bit on that and your experience of applying for Oxford University and then changing gears and applying for and entering the University of St. Andrews.
Thanks so much, Bob. It's really great to be here. And I actually just in beginning, I know how difficult it is for everybody out on the West Coast right now. And I just wanted to pass on my feelings of concern and sympathy and solidarity with everyone, given this catastrophic experience you're all going through with the wildfires on top of COVID. I know it's very difficult, and I greatly appreciate the fact that in spite of everything, people want to engage on these topics, and we were really at a kind of pivotal moment here in the United States. So just to everybody who's participating from Los Angeles, hang in there, and hopefully we'll all get through all of this. And actually, I'll use that as a bit of a pivot into the question that you asked me, Bob, as well, because I, as you said, I grew up in a small town in the northeast of England, Bishop Auckland, a town that had fallen on really hard times. I was born in 1965, just as all the coal mines that had really underpinned the economy of that town and the surrounding areas started to close. And also at a point, that everyone is, aware from world history, just before the oil shock in the 1970s, where, there was the beginnings of massive change in the economy. So the town was, in somewhat dire straits for quite a bit of this period. Everything's starting to change and to close down. People out of work on a mass scale, not dissimilar from some of the things that we've been seeing, here recently as well. But it was also at the height of the Cold War. I mean, I was born just after the whole Cuban Missile Crisis, but in the 1980s, in the sort of formative time of my life, we had another war scare. 1983, 84, you've got a picture of Ronald Reagan, just behind you. This was the period of the Reagan and Gorbachev beginning of their negotiations, but not quite. In the early 1980s, we had the standoff over the Euro missiles, the SS-20 and Pershing missiles being stationed respectively in Western Europe and then in the Soviet Union, close to the Eastern Bloc borders with NATO. And so I grew up with this expectation that there could be at any moment a nuclear exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union. And I started studying Russian against that backdrop in 1984. Now, the story that you alluded to about making a switch from Oxford to St Andrews was in that heady period of the 1980s. I wanted to study Russian, but my school didn't teach it. And you had to be able to have an A-level, an advanced qualification in Russian from your high school to be able to go to most universities in the United Kingdom. People at my school, which was a school that was really trying to turn itself around, wanted to encourage me and a couple of other kids to try to apply to Oxford. And it wasn't that easy because you had to sit an entrance exam for Oxford and also Cambridge, but not for most of the other universities in Britain. I was persuaded to sit the exam. It was a bit of a disaster because most of the questions, I hadn't even covered at school. I was asked to sit a philosophy exam, and there wasn't philosophy taught anywhere in my school district. And to be honest, I wasn't quite sure, what most of the questions were asking, but, I must have attempted them in sufficient a fashion that I got invited for an interview at Oxford as a kind of alternative pathway. And the interview was one of those, awful, humiliating experiences that most people have really living in their nightmares. A kid from the north of England, my mum had made my clothes for the interview. I had a rather strong accent. I'd never been anywhere, like this before. I kind of show up at the interview. And if any of the people listening have seen the movie or the play Billy Elliot, where a young boy from a coal mining town in the north of England, actually very close to where I grew up, it's the setting for this, tries to go to the Royal Ballet School and has a humiliating experience. That was exactly the same sort of time frame. That's exactly what happened. My fellow candidates for the interview claimed they couldn't understand what I was saying. People were making fun of my clothes, and eventually I got tripped up on the way into the interview, banging my nose on the doorstop, having a nosebleed. But the professor who interviewed me, who was a very kind and wise person, sort of suggested to me perhaps Oxford was not for me, and gave me quite a lot of time in asking what did I want to do. I explained to him I actually wanted to study Russian. He said, you won't be able to do that here. And he talked through my other university applications with me, hit on St Andrews, and the rest of that is history. And I went to St Andrews in 1984, just as Mikhail Gorbachev is about to come into power, with the Reagan-Gorbachev talks on arms control starting off. And in 1987, 1988, I actually got a scholarship to study in the Soviet Union just as the Gorbachev-Reagan summits hit their peak. And I was there for the Ronald Reagan's visit to Moscow and the Moscow summit in the summer of 1988, at which time I met an American professor who was there as an advisor to one of the American TV stations, actually NBC News, and he told me about scholarships to the United States. So that's how all of this kind of came about. It's all about timing, and it's really about, you know, being around in a very consequential historical moment. And I think, you know, we're going full circle on so many of these issues again. So that's it.
Thank you. I think you observed in that year when you were an exchange student that you thought that Russia and the West had a great many similarities, and by maybe the West, you were talking more about Great Britain and the United States on that. But I think that was the first part of your comparison between our countries that continued on in a more robust ways. I think I'm going to skip over a bit the time you spent at Harvard. I know in 1991 you got a master's in Russian and modern history, and you continued to do research there at the Kennedy School. And in 1998, you got a doctorate in philosophy there and became a U.S. citizen in 2002. I think those are interesting periods, but we're limited time today. So I think I want to read you a section of this book, that's just a paragraph from the book that just came out. It's Robert Woodward's Rage. And in it, he says the NSA and the CIA had evidence, highly classified, that the Russians had placed malware in the election registration system in at least 2 counties in Florida, St. Lucie County and Washington County. There was no evidence yet that the malware had been activated. It was sitting there to be used. The voting system vendor used in Florida was used by state election registration systems all around the country. The Russian malware was sophisticated and could be activated in counties with particular demographics. For instance, in areas with high percentage of Black residents, the malware could erase every 10th voter, almost certainly reducing the total vote count for Democrats. The same potentially could be activated to reduce Trump's votes in Republican districts. The bottom line is the Russians are here. What is your analysis of the situation about the Russian involvement in U.S. elections, both in 2016 and 18, and more importantly today in 2020?
Yeah, and thanks for laying all of that out there, Bob, because I think this is a pretty critical issue that we have to assess as we go forward into what's going to be a very consequential election in November. Now, first of all, there's a couple of aspects to what you've just laid out there. I'm not sure, because I haven't seen Bob Woodward's book yet. I've just been, you know, like many people, watching his interviews and, you know, reading about it in the paper, about how much in depth he gets into some of the analysis of, you know, what the Russians may or may not have been doing there. But first of all, there was a probing element to this. You know, clearly an intent to see, you know, how much they could get onto systems in certain key areas without being detected. But there was an element of wanting to be detected, to give people exactly that kind of sense that this is, again, almost gets back to the war scares that we had with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then that I described in the 1980s that set me off on my path for studying Russian, that there might be an element there of, you know, gamesman and brinksmanship. They wanted us to know that they had the capacity to attack us. So just like with a nuclear weapon, we actually have statements from some of Russia's technological and cyber officials talking about having the nuclear option in cyber that they could use against us. And we know that the Russians have penetrated systems in many other countries. We probably had something of a failure of imagination to think that the Russians could mess about in either our electoral systems or in you know, many of our public opinion and social media systems in the way that they had in countries closer to their borders that had, once been very much under their influence, places like Moldova or Ukraine or Georgia, for example. And I think the Russians wanted us to know, just as you're alluding there, that they're here, that they mean business, and that they can have an impact. I think it's also because they weren't detected system-wide, but as you're suggesting, they were there in a certain system that had applicability more broadly. They wanted to at least give the impression that they could have wide systemic influence. So in a way, this was for them a scare tactic. It was also intended to weaken, once this was all revealed, as they probably anticipated that it would be, people's own confidence in their own systems, in their own electoral systems, and in their democracy. Now, why would that be the case? The United States knows how to run a democratic election. We haven't forgotten how to do that. And we have a very complex system. It's not just the issue of the popular vote in the Electoral College, it's just that every state and every local government handles their own part of the electoral system. This is not a nationwide, one-size-fits-all electoral system. But what the Russians wanted to do, was kind of try to give that impression that somehow they could have a much broader reach. And their view has always been that the United States interferes in other people's elections, not in the way they might think of the CIA toppling leaders or trying to kind of influence elections, but because we have a very robust election monitoring system. We've had a whole networks of efforts to help support election transparency and free and fair election systems. We've been at the forefront of this for decades. And also the US rather, has been highly respected, along with actually the UK and other European countries, for its democracy for a long period of time. And the Russians, and particularly Putin, have always thought that when they hold an election themselves, and of course there's all kinds of election discrepancies, the United States is always at the forefront of calling them out. And when Putin has sought re-election as president so many times, of course, we have called him out. And in 2011, 2012, when Putin was returning to the presidency, having been prime minister for several years, there was all kinds of malpractice in their elections. There was all kinds of interference with the election vote and ballot stuffing and all kinds of irregularities that external monitors saw. And the United States called Russia out and Putin out. And this was a very difficult period for him in the return to the presidency. There were large-scale protests in the streets of Moscow and many other cities, as people might recall. And I think Putin and others around him wanted to have revenge. And they wanted to pay that right back at the United States, to have us feel some sense of doubt as well about the legitimacy of our own elections. Well, they really achieved that in 2016. Because not only was it this probing, which actually wasn't widely known to people, it was the attempts to hack public opinion by influencing social media through Twitter, Facebook, the use of bots to amplify out discord. There was the hack and release efforts going into the DNC and other email accounts and putting out information and banking on the US media for propagating that information even further, kind of fencing in stolen goods approach, rather than looking at what the Russians were doing and why they might be doing this. But they knew that the media would jump upon all of this information. So in 2018, when we had the midterms, I know we haven't got a lot of time, so people might want to get to this more in questions. We knew already what the Russians were up to. And we knew that we had to, first of all, harden the systems and make it much more difficult for the Russians to do these probing exercises and to get back onto the systems again. Now, we also had to start thinking about how to back up all the electoral systems. And the good news, I think, for 2020 is that we've really done a lot already on this. The actual systems, I think people should have confidence in the integrity of the election systems. I mean, this is actually, frankly, why so many people are asking people to go out and vote early and also to have paper ballots, because Vladimir Putin cannot hijack the mail. Vladimir Putin cannot just kind of go in there and, change paper ballots, or the Russians can't. It's the kind of the electronic tabulation, of course, which is some of the concerns, and also the voter suppression, where they might still be able, by using Facebook, Twitter, and other social media jump on, because some of the efforts, unfortunately, that are already going on by, political actors in our own domestic space to suppress the vote. So we have actually responded quite aggressively behind the scenes. DHS, Department of Homeland Security, all kinds of election officials at the republic and local state level, members of Congress have paid particular attention to this. We've actually, I think, rolled back many of the things that the Russians did or were attempting to do in 2016 for 2020. I have to say that I think the bigger problem now is ourselves, our own divisions, and the only way, and also the whole dynamic that has been set up in this election campaign.
Thank you. I wanted to make a comment on Peter Strzok's new book that came from that book. Peter Strzok is a former FBI counterintelligence investigator who led the FBI's investigation into Hillary Clinton's use of a personal email server, suggests that Russia will use a wide variety of tactics to disrupt future US elections, including the release of incriminating information that Russia has spent years collecting to incriminate US politicians. Fiona, how significant is Putin's ability to gather compromising materials on our politicians?
Well, it's pretty significant. I mean, this is something that the Russians do at home. They call it kompromat, from compromising information. And many of the tactics that we see the Russian security services adopting abroad are things that they've already honed to, their own state of perfection at home to deal with domestic adversaries and to clamp down. So, they know what they're doing. A lot of this is building on tactics that the Soviet KGB and the Soviet system also adopted. Again, I said, this is a long, tried and true set of practices they have. In the old days, obviously, they didn't have social media or, email to hack into. They'd steal documents, but they'd certainly collect compromising material, information, photographs, to bribe people, manipulate people. We go back to the 1970s and 80s and, see some of this work, disinformation, spreading rumors, spreading falsehoods. What they particularly specialize in is using material that's also produced at home. And this is why I made the reference to the media and, the way that they've studied the way that the Western media works. If the media had spent more time back in 2016, looking at what the Russians were doing, was it the Russians? Why would they do this? Rather than, passing John Podesta's pasta recipes, as interesting and perhaps as delicious as they may be, we'd actually have been in a very different place. I mean, this is the most ridiculous thing about it, and I spoke out about it at the time. That, again, they were fencing in stolen goods, but that is what Putin and others were banking on. They know that there's a distinct prurient interest in our own system on any kind of salacious material. Our own politicians know it. That's why there is such a store put in opposition research to dig up dirt on your opponent. And so what the Russians do, who specialize in digging up in dirt on their own domestic opponents and people internationally, they just pick up that same information that actors in our own system pick up, and then they propagate it even further. And, we've played directly into their hands. Facebook and all the information that people post there, people's failure to take care of their own internet email security, weaknesses and backdoors in all kinds of systems. The Russians often run their own, financial crimes operatives as well, or at least let them loose. So many of the malware and these, hijack efforts for Bitcoin that are run today, where people's internet systems taken hostage are being operated out of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus by Russian and other actors, and the Russian government will turn a blind eye to them because they're sort of serving a purpose by making things difficult for others. We've seen, for example, the NotPetya malware that was used against the Ukraine, devastating effects that had when it was spread inadvertently across all kinds of international systems, costing billions of dollars worth of damage. And the Russians know that doing the forensic work to be able to trace this back takes time, so they kind of have advantage of time while we're catching up on trying to follow the various cyber traces to find out who did it. But in the meantime, it has this impact. But the hack and release proved to be so effective in 2016 in terms of, really stirring up a political mess here in the United States, that of course it's highly likely that they will do this again. So I would just caution everybody, WikiLeaks in a very similar, situation, to be very careful about all of this information. And perhaps what we need to do is what the French did in 2017 when the Russians did something similar. They hacked into the campaign materials of Macron right on the eve of the French presidential election. But the French system kind of closed that down. They didn't really let that get propagated any further, and their media didn't pick up on it. So, I think our media and other actors have wised up to this. Facebook is now much more aware than they were in 2016. Twitter the same, about how actors who want to denigrate our democracy are operating there. And of course, we all feel that Facebook and other social media operations need to do much more to tackle this. But we're aware now, and that means that we have to call it out when it happens. So we don't have to run with this information. It's only incriminating, right, if people start to use it in a way that makes the situation worse. I mean, the first thing to do in blackmail is to come clean and to kind of make it much more difficult for the blackmailer to be able to use information against you. And that's the kind of the approach that we have to take with this kind of information.
Thank you. President Trump has talked about preparing for a third term as president. He's also, when asked whether or not he would honor the results of the election, he's hesitated giving an answer. And when he eventually gives the answer, he says, well, maybe not if it involves corrupt mail-in ballots. I'd like to read a sentence from this new book of Michael Cohen's, Disloyal, where he says, please remember what I testified to Congress the second time. There is a serious danger that Donald Trump will not leave office easily, and there is a real chance of not having a peaceful transition. When he jokes about running for again in 2024 and gets a crowd of thousands to chant Trump 2024, he's not joking. Trump never jokes. What do you think the risks are there, and how do you foresee potential scenarios playing out?
Well, look, this is why I said within both my testimony back in November last year, and as I just said at the beginning of this discussion, that our own political divisions are now the biggest problem that we face. Because I mean, Vladimir Putin isn't stoking up these kinds of discussions. I mean, Vladimir Putin himself is now trying to set up his presidency in perpetuity. He just had constitutional amendments to facilitate his ability to run again for president beyond 2024. If there was, kind of a serious contemplation of something like this in the United States, it would also have to have constitutional amendments. Loose talk is just loose talk, but it's also extremely dangerous in undercutting and undermining everybody's faith in our own democracy. The fact that we're having this discussion or even raising these issues either in books or just in these questions and on the pages of newspapers shows that we have a crisis in our democracy at present. Many other countries have gone through this kind of crisis, but it really shows again how consequential this election is, but also how important it is to put back faith in our institutions. Irrespective of how things turn out in November, we've got a heck of a lot of work to do to put faith back in our democracy. The Russians didn't create these divisions. It's not Vladimir Putin who's stoking off this discussion here in the United States. He's doing that back on the home front for his own purposes. And we have to, I think, very seriously call out any discussions about any constitutional changes that are not done through any kind of the proper authority. And that's why I and all of the other people who made the decision to testify back in November did so, because we believe in representative democracy. We believe in the Constitution. We took an oath to the Constitution, and we believe in congressional oversight. We also believe in we the people, and we the people, us talking today, and everybody who's listening to this, have agency. And the biggest single active independent agency that we have is to go out and vote. And the one message that I would like, people to take away from this, and, I think people in California are very well aware of this, is that it's extraordinarily difficult for any actor, domestic or foreign, to play around on the margins if we have an overwhelming vote turnout. There's already a discussion going on in the United States. Some of my colleagues at Brookings are engaged in this, people like E.J. Dion and others that you, Bob, know, about having mandatory voting in the United States. That might be a bridge too far for some people. Other countries have it, like Australia. Greece has mandatory voting, although I don't think it's very rigidly enforced in Greece, but in Australia, it's kind of a matter of course, and people can't understand why others don't have it. But if you start to think about, this is the 100th anniversary of women getting universal suffrage. I'm also exactly the same age as the Voting Rights Act. So, in my lifetime, just before that, every citizen in the United States did not have full voting rights. African Americans, Native Americans in particular, but many others were denied suffrage. So if you think about how many people have died and put themselves on the line for the right to vote, it should be a no-brainer for everyone. We can push back on domestic divisions. We can push back on people with all this loose talk about rupturing the Constitution. And we can push back on Putin and other adversaries who want to stir up problems within our democracy if we all turn out in large numbers and vote. Because it's when it's at the margins or it's razor thin, that's when domestic and foreign actors can really mess around and can reduce people's faith in their democracy.
I know these things, both good and bad, progress slowly sometimes. I can remember being in the office talking with Igor Ivanov at the very moment that his boss was in front of the Duma demanding that the Duma abolish the election of governors and let him appoint all the Russian governors. And the Duma cooperated and unanimously gave him that support. But that was a few years ago, but it has progressed from there into what many of us think Putin will be president of Russia until he passes away. I'd like you to tell us a bit about what you're thinking about when you say there is nothing for you here. There is nothing for you here.
Oh, this is the title of the book that I'm basically writing at the moment. I just got a book contract, which is really looking at how you give opportunity and equal access to people, and tackle inequality in an age of decline. And it really goes back to my experiences of growing up in Bishop Auckland in the northeast of England, back in that period from 65 through to 89 when I came to the United States. And how much so many people were left out of the economic changes, just simply left behind by the economic, social and political changes that were underway in the United Kingdom. And when I went to the Soviet Union, you referenced before that I saw an awful lot of similarities between the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union, basically a post-industrial collapse. And I was really shocked by how similar my experience in the northeast of England was with the Soviet Union. This is just as it's about to fall apart. And I have to say that unfortunately, in the 30 years that I've been in the United States and all the years that I've been here as a citizen, I've started to see the same phenomenon here. And I think that sort of sense of being left behind, being left out, of really not having the same access to opportunity or access to outcomes as people are referring to it now, has an awful lot to say about how we got to 2016 in the United States, but also in the United Kingdom, where people in my hometown, and 61% of people living in my hometown, for example, voted in favour of Brexit, feeling completely left out of all of the developments in Europe as well as in the United Kingdom. And of course, we saw the upset in the 2016 election with the election of President Trump, by narrow margins, albeit, but in all the key areas of Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and all the places had literally been left behind after the collapse of the major manufacturing industries in the United States. And I would actually argue that, that phenomenon, the fact that, people failed to address it, while for 40 years thereabouts, since the 1980s, as being a major factor in where we are now. And the quote that you made there, that there's nothing for you here, that was my father in the 1980s when I, was talking to my father and also my grandfather about, what should I do, kind of with myself. And my dad said to me, there's nothing for you here, you should leave. You should go to London, or you should try, if you can, to go to Europe or to the United States and look for opportunity. So I'm trying to, put this together in a book at the moment, because I do believe that this has become part of our national security crisis. As I said, the divisions that have come out of this inequality, this lack of equal access to opportunity, and of course in the United States, race is involved with this as well, not just, economic disadvantage, and all of the many issues that we're all grappling with in this very consequential electoral season. This has become a source of national security crisis as well, because we're so divided against each other, we're so polarized, we're so busy focusing on what makes us different, that we've forgotten about what unites the people of the United States. And as we're so polarized, this gives an opportunity for Russia and others to play upon all those divisions and to just amplify the discord, creating more chaos and weakening the United States further. But it also prevents us from competing effectively with countries like China that are rising. So unless we can get back to putting our own house in order, dealing with these divisions and coming back to the things that bind us together, the more hopeful aspect of this, which we all should be very concerned about, the United States is not going to live up to the potential that we all know is there. And so I came away actually from my experience in the testimony thinking that I'd set off to try to deal with Russian interference in our democracy, attempts to weaken our democracy, but really realizing at the end of this really wrenching period of impeachment and everything that had gone before it, and everything as it's playing out now, that the real security dilemma is actually ourselves, that we have become our own worst enemies, whether we intend to or not. And this polarization, or this infighting between the two political parties, is really kind of bringing the country down onto its knees. And we have to do something to all pull together. I mean, there's all kinds of ways in which we can do this. And in fact, I think, World Affairs Councils like out in Los Angeles and elsewhere can really play a role as well, because you can create this kind of sense of a broader national discussion. And I mean, I think obviously California has been way ahead of the rest of the United States on so many issues in any case. I mean, you're the fifth largest economy, now grappling with the wildfires. It's amazing to see how communities are pulling together to try to, figure out how to rebuild after this period of devastation. But we're going to have to treat this in exactly the same way across the United States. We're on fire politically. We need to have the same, idea of pulling communities together to put out these political fires and to try to figure out how we're going to build into the future. So, I mean, that's really kind of the backdrop to, why I wanted to write a book, a very different take on, what I've done before. But really, people like Vladimir Putin and others can't play on our divisions if they're not there, and if we're tackling them ourselves, that is.
Thank you. Could you give us just a brief recap of what's happened recently in Belarus and explain what's going on there and predict what you think will happen, and conclude with what you think the U.S. policy ought to be toward Belarus in that situation?
Well, I mean, there's actually a lot of our own domestic dilemmas are tied up in this as well, because I'll just, kind of put the last question, first. The United States not just was always the leader on oversight of democratic elections on an international scale, calling people out, for free and fair elections and for the health of their democracy and good governance. We were also very much at the forefront of freedom of expression and of assembly, and of, the people's right, thinking about our own constitution of we the people, to be able to choose their own political outcomes. And we have, over the last several years, fallen short of that international leadership that we were renowned for. And people look to us to stand up at times like this, at crisis in other places, to basically call out for people's voices to be taken into account through a free and fair electoral process. And what's going on in Belarus is the population of Belarus on a large scale wanting to have a free and fair election, to have their voice heard. They're not seeking to join the West or to have an association with Europe in the way that we saw with Ukraine, several years ago with the Maidan, the Euromaidan, the Ukrainian street protests. They're protesting the efforts of Lukashenko, the very long-serving Belarusian president who's been in office since 1994, to just stay in indefinitely without the kinds of constitutional amendments even that Vladimir Putin has been attempting. And what the message of Belarus is the right of the people to choose their own governance and form of governance over longer term, versus a strongman who wants to stay in power indefinitely and wants to use the power of the military or the police forces, the security forces, to keep himself in place and to falsify an election. I mean, that's what we're seeing playing out there. Now, for Vladimir Putin and Russia, for Putin, this is extraordinarily uncomfortable because, here is Lukashenko, who's been in power since 1994. Belarus is probably the country that's closest to Russia. Russia and Belarus created a sort of quasi, up until now, rather symbolic union to recognize the closeness of the two countries after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Commonwealth of Independent States, which was previously an umbrella organization that brought together Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and a handful of others. Lukashenko has always, up until now, been very keen to keep his distance from Putin and Russia and to stop this union from going into full effect, because he likes being the independent president of Belarus. He didn't want to be kind of the equivalent of a provincial governor in Russia and the Russian Federation. And so he's always been playing Vladimir Putin off and Russia off against Europe and the United States to some degree, to try to keep his own personal sovereignty rather than the country's sovereignty intact. Now he's in big trouble. He's got all of these protests. And here's Vladimir Putin, who also would like to give himself at least the option of staying in power for a very long time, through to 2036, by which time he'll have been in power for 36 years. And, we've already had Lukashenko in power since 1994. So for Putin, it's really, a critical issue how this is resolved. And he certainly doesn't want a repeat of Ukraine, where Russia went in and, annexed Crimea and has got itself embroiled in a war with Ukraine and for the sovereignty over the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine, which had a lot of Russian speakers who were settled there, and also getting into a battle with Europe and the United States over a kind of proxy war over where Ukraine goes. He wants to make it very clear that Belarus is part of their sphere of influence of Russia, but also that, of course, what's happening in Belarus casts a very long shadow on his own version and vision for how his presidency should play out in Russia. So, it's very much now intertwined, Belarus, with the future of Russia and Putin's own presidency. And we should be watching very closely how he now attempts to resolve this. And we just recently saw Lukashenko and Putin sit down. And what's interesting is that Putin was actually urging Lukashenko to come to some kind of accommodation with the opposition there. Because the Russians have warned that they might intervene, but it seems that they actually might want to not intervene because of the risks of this getting out of hand, because it's clear that the Belarusian people are thinking about their own sovereignty, not just about what happens to Lukashenko, and are making it clear that they themselves, because they're flying the old Belarusian flag, don't want to end up like Crimea annexed into the Russian Federation or to become yet another set of provinces of Russia. So this is a pretty consequential moment, but I don't think, sadly, that the United States has got a leg to stand on in being able to resolve this because of what's going on in our own democratic system right now.
Thank you very much. Jessica, it's your time to get questions from our participants.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hill. Thank you. We've got a ton of questions coming in. Our first one is, should the US engage in aggressive cyber interference in the affairs of our rivals? who are engaging in cyber attacks against the US. Are we doing so now? What are we doing, and what can and should we be doing?
I think we've all learned that there's a great deal of risk in cyberspace of unintended consequences. For example, on the NotPetya malware that the Russians used against Ukraine, it wasn't clear that they intended to bring down, kind of global systems, including like the NHS in the National Health Service in the UK, for example. All kinds of major Fortune 500 companies were affected by that malware, which shows that it's very difficult to contain these kinds of cyber attacks. So I think what we've been trying to do is to blunt the effect and block Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and many other adversaries, including non-state actors, from being able to launch these kinds of attacks. So we're really on the aggressive defense front of this, I would say. We have been tackling what the Russians were trying to do in terms of our electoral systems. We know that they've also been probing in energy and other critical infrastructure systems. We've been trying to send very strong messages to them that there will be consequences for doing this. I think that part of the issue here is the Russians anticipate or expect that we will take aggressive action, just as they thought about this during the periods of our nuclear confrontation or near confrontation during the Cold War. So in a way, they're sort of preempting to get deterrent effect for themselves. I mean, I think a lot of the things that we saw, could be in the realm of a very aggressive deterrent operation from the Russians. So what we need to do is take this aggressive defensive stance, but also we need to be very clear with the Russians. This is why we need diplomacy, not diplomacy for the sake of engagement or just having a dialogue and talking to the Russians, but be able to have constant interactions with them at all the top professional levels, through the Pentagon, through our intelligence services, through all of the different actors that would have a role in countering a Russian cyber operation. And this is obviously in the military and security sphere, to let them know that there will be consequences for doing this kind of operation beyond sanctions. But there is a great deal of risk that we have to consider very carefully about just ourselves launching aggressive cyber operations that are not in response to activity of adversaries. So this is something that we have to, again, be very serious and very consistent and coherent about. And my biggest concern at the moment is, because of the nature of the current administration, of which I was part, we've had so much turnover in personnel at the top levels, and we've had an awful lot of incoherence and inconsistency in our approach. And we have to deal with Russia and other adversaries like China, Iran, North Korea and others, to be very coherent and consistent, and to make sure that every senior member of our administration, the people who are interacting with them, has full authorization to deal directly, to send very strong messages.
Thank you so much. And on your note about people that have left, this questioner asks or says, Dr. Hill, thank you for your service. About what percentage of Russia experts have left the State Department in the last 3 years? What % were forced out?
I think it's actually hard to say about actual percentages. I think what we've had is a lot of attrition. It's not just people like myself who gave, in my case, I gave myself a 2-year time frame to go into the administration to see if there's something I could do in that time frame. And I said a little bit longer than that, but I'd already made the decision that I would leave. But there's also been a lot of early retirements, kind of people leaving, and then attrition, and not people being replaced. I think overall we've had, on Russia in particular, over this period of the last couple of decades, particularly since 9/11, a lot of redeployment of people who were Russia experts to other activities and other portfolios, particularly as we were focused on counterterrorism, or we were very worried about developments in the Middle East, and we tended to repurpose Russia and other regional experts for focusing on, say, Afghanistan or later Syria and the Middle East, or kind of even pushing people towards looking more at China and at other issue sets. there was a kind of a feeling, we actually lost, I think, kind of our focus on Russia for some considerable period, that, Russia was a sort of a thing of the past, and we didn't need to kind of bring in on such a large scale a new generation of scholars and experts and analysts. So there is, as I said, really more of a problem of attrition, and really having a bit of a generation gap of expertise that we have to address. And that's same at the State Department, in the Pentagon, and across many of our other agencies. Now, I would also argue that it's not in anyone's best interest for us to ramp up again against Russia as we did over the Cold War. Russia should not be the main adversary. We have a problem. The Russians continue to see us as the main adversary. The Russians don't want to find themselves pitted against China, for example. So, I mean, I think they keep on testing their skills and throwing everything that they've got at us as a kind of proxy for everybody else and every other threat that comes along. Whereas we have got an awful lot of issues on our agenda. And I think that what we also have to aim towards, we don't want to be in a perpetual confrontation with Russia like we were under the Cold War. We have to keep pushing Russia towards a less confrontational, less aggressive, less devastating, more stable relationship, even if we have to be somewhat circumspect and realistic about what the chances are of having a more cooperative relationship with Russia at this point. But we should not be ramping back up, or even, trying to contemplate a long-term confrontation with Russia. We have to figure out how to get it off onto a different trajectory, that relationship.
Thank you. And on the topic of China, how credible are recent reports that China is attempting to use similar techniques as the Russians, but to swing the election to Joe Biden?
Well, look, I think we should be very cautious and very aware of China's abilities. China has basically penetrated as many systems as it possibly can to amass a data and a kind of colossal amounts of data, personal data about Americans, commercial data, and whenever they have found an opportunity, they've also been trying to do this on the national security front. We've been concerned about vaccines and other scientific research as well. China, I think, is a across-the-board systemic threat to us, whereas Russia remains a military and a espionage threat, very similar to some of its activities during the Cold War. Whether the Chinese have got a particular preference, they don't seem to be operating in the same way as Russia, which has a goal of sowing chaos to give people a sense of defeat, in fact, and to basically completely reduce our confidence in the health of our democracy. China obviously seems much more focused on more kind of conventional approach of trying to outmaneuver and kind of win against the United States in a larger global competition. It's not just seems to be focused on bringing us down. And I think China also wants to make a series of deals with the United States overall to stabilize the US-China relationship, not just on trade and economics, but maybe in the military sphere too. And I think in that regard, they probably are more focused on having a more predictable interlocutor. I think there's been a great deal of frustration on the part of China about the unpredictability of the current administration. Actually, to be fair, also on the Russian side, I think there's been quite a bit of frustration among Russian circles that are not their intelligence and security services, but in the diplomatic circles, that they have failed to make much progress on arms control at the moment. So, the kind of Russians on the one hand have been trying to sow chaos, but on the other, they actually wanted to get a deal on arms control to extend the New START treaty, for example, and to reach some progress on the new phase of arms control, and they've not succeeded at that. So it's a very complicated question, I think, to figure out what the real motivations of countries are. But needless to say, we have to take care of our own democratic systems and make it very difficult for outsiders to play in our electoral systems and our democracy overall. So we should be equally concerned about China and Russia and their attempts to meddle.
Thank you. Do you think that foreign countries such as Russia want Trump to be reelected, or do you think they have no preference who is elected, so long as they can sow domestic mistrust in the election process and our government institutions in general?
You know, that's really a very good question, because if we look back to 2016, it's clear that the Russians also, like many others, expected Hillary Clinton to be elected, and they wanted to inflict grievous wounds against her. And insofar as they wanted to weaken her, have questions against her legitimacy, about her legitimacy, and also to kind of create, just as the question is implying, a great deal of chaos and people not having any confidence at all in their electoral outcomes. So I think it's less about the person per se as it is about the outcome. And if people in the United States feel that their democracy is failing and feel that the country is weakened and that we're so preoccupied with our own divisions and our own infighting. So, if that can be produced as a result of questions about the legitimacy of a Joe Biden, it probably comes out exactly in the same way as a re-election of a very unpredictable President Trump, who has become the subject of so many books that that Bob has been showing us today. I mean, I think the Russians will be very happy with an outcome in which we spend our entire next 4 years fighting with ourselves about the future of America as our international standing falls further and further. I mean, I think most people have probably seen by now the recent Pew poll, where the standing of the United States, even among some of our traditional allies like the United Kingdom, Japan, and South Korea, has really plummeted. And in some countries, the standing of President Trump is about neck and neck with Vladimir Putin, or even less. So this in itself is a success for all of those Russian actors who wanted to see, the kind of United States in a political predicament after the 2016 election.
Thank you. In light of the Abraham Agreement yesterday, where do you see the situation heading with the Palestinian state vis-a-vis other Middle Eastern state leaders?
Well, this was not, obviously in my portfolio when I was at the National Security Council, but, there has been, obviously a lot of overlap with working on Europe and Russia. And Russia actually pays also a very particular interest, not just in the Middle East, but also in the future of Israel, which is also a very interesting point of observation there. I think what we're seeing overall is most of the Middle East actors giving up on the idea of a separate Palestinian state and deciding that it's time to come to terms with the long-term existence of Israel and to basically also take action against Iran. It's very much the case that most of these other Middle Eastern players see Iran now as a much bigger threat. So this really does seem to be portending the end of many of the Middle Eastern players orienting themselves around the future of a Palestinian state.
Thank you. And I know we're almost at the end of the hour. I don't know if you have any extra time or not.
No, please go ahead.
Okay, great. Can you say more about your concern that the greater danger to our elections is our own division?
Yeah, I can. And it's the way in which there is the amplification of discord. And it's also, I mean, the Russians have been very good at kind of figuring out how Americans use social media, which is in fact to separate ourselves off from each other, to be in our own information bubbles. And this is where an adversary like Russia or China or anyone else, with a bit of, social research, like the Internet Research Agency that everyone has talked about so much, can really kind of figure out how to play off these, very separate information streams. And you see, Russia Today, RT, Sputnik, and a lot of the other interventions that Russia has had, very much focused on highlighting the areas of discord. It's not just the United States, frankly, it's been the United Kingdom. If there was a lot of research done during the Scottish independence referendum, that showed that Russia was paying an unusual amount of attention to the Scottish National Party and the Scottish independence movement, as opposed to the movement that was trying to keep the union together. Or similar in Brexit, although parliamentary reports were somewhat inconclusive. There was a lot of suggestive evidence, and a lot of academics have done research on this, showing that the Russians were playing up the Brexit part of the discussions rather than the discussions about keeping Europe together. So it's all playing on that dividing line. Now, what's really interesting is you look at the flip side in Russia itself. Putin does his actual utmost to play to the broader majority. You don't see race baiting and religion baiting in Russia. Putin doesn't do any of that. Putin does play with a kind of version of a, conservative alt-right nationalist groupings within Russia. But he's also very, very careful to make sure that he reaches out to all other sides as well. Although Russia is 80% Russian Orthodox and technically speaking 80% ethnic Russian and of course majority Russian speaking, it has large Muslim, Jewish and other religious minorities and also ethnic minorities, Tatars, Ukrainians, Chechens and others. And Putin puts himself forward as the protector and the champion of all of these other groups as well. The people that he goes after are people like Alexei Navalny, who's most notably been poisoned to take him out of the action recently, are not representative of larger streams in the Russian view and are not likely to mobilize other people out in protest. Vladimir Putin has been extraordinarily nervous about the kinds of protests that we've seen on US streets and cities. He would not be stirring these up. He would not be pitting one side off against the other because he knows that that can lead to disaster. And that was what happened in Russia in the 1990s, and also in the last days of the Soviet Union, which brought the state down to its onto its knees. So we should look very closely at the way that Vladimir Putin tries to create unity at home, but tries to encourage disunity abroad, and we should learn something from this.
It's really interesting. We've had a lot of questions over the past weeks about the role of international organizations going forward. And this questioner asks, what's your forecast for NATO's relevance in US foreign policy in the coming decade?
Well, I think we've seen already that NATO, like many other organizations, is having to do a lot of soul searching itself to think about its future. We're in a difficult time where not everybody agrees on a shared threat perception, where there's a lot of domestic turmoil in many countries. And obviously, in a situation where a lot of the threats, either from a rising China, which is a different nature of threat for individual countries, or issues like climate change, which you're contending with very clearly in California, but we all are. The existing institutions aren't really very well positioned to deal with this. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but how do you deal with a rising China that's trying to expand economic influence, has predatory economic practices, maybe is collecting up all kinds of data by clandestine means, and clearly is kind of bent on degrees of system domination. How does NATO factor in China? Then how does NATO deal with issues like climate change that actually might create waves of refugees across Europe, far greater than even the refugee crisis that Europe is dealing with now as a result of wars and displacement, from internal divisions in many of the countries bordering the Mediterranean. So NATO is going to have to really engage in, now that we're beyond the post-World War II and post-Cold War period, in an examination of how can you use the strengths that NATO has amassed, how do you create a common purpose and a common vision for a new age where many of the challenges and threats are outside of the traditional arena. I mean, look, we're dealing with a crisis of all the institutions that were developed either at the end of World War II or as a result of a consequence of the post-Cold War environment. We've now moved 30 years on since the fall of the Berlin Wall. We're in a whole new era. And I think we really have a lot of hard work to do, not just rebuilding our institutions at home, but rebuilding our international institutions by taking in a proper calculation of the new threats. It's just a really big agenda that we have ahead of us.
Thank you. This will be our final question. A lot of people are asking, would you go back to work under a different administration, or how do you see your career going forward?
Thanks, and sorry, I'm having to take some water here.
No worries.
I don't know if everybody else. Well, you've got all the smoke, so it's kind of pretty awful situation.
You've been speaking for an hour, so you get a.
Yeah, and I have allergies, and I've had the window open, so I think I've got weed or whatever blowing in at the moment. But I think for all of us now, not just myself, and kind of contemplating, next steps. We're all in a situation where with COVID-19, we've all been forced to rethink. I mean, we're all, by sitting at home, actually taking action and, kind of thinking about how we're all going to get out of this. I've been thinking myself about the real limitations of the executive branch and federal government. It was something that, I was forced to think about during the whole impeachment trial. And I really feel that as long as we have a federal system that is not undermining everything that we're all trying to do on a larger scale. I mean, I think our biggest risk right now is the incompetence of our federal government and lack of trust in our federal government. There's an awful lot of things that have to be done on the grassroots level by all of us, by everyone who's participating in this discussion today. And for the time being, I really see for my next step, having been back at Brookings, about how we can really mobilize people to take action at the grassroots, at the state and local government level, to really kind of fix all of the things that ail us. Not everybody can be in the federal government. Again, I really genuinely came out thinking that the problem's not Russia per se or China per se, it's ourselves. Our inability to get our act together. And the fact that, kind of this administration has been fighting with everybody so much on the outside, that the Democratic and Republican Party are fighting with each other so much that we've lost sight of the country. And, kind of people's voices are not being heard. And, we're so polarized and so partisan that we can't do anything in the larger common good. And we need to have people, kind of speaking again about a common purpose, that there's a whole group of reports out there on this right now, thinking about how we might volunteer, how we might get national service back into perspective, and how we can put trust back into government. We really have to start at the local and state level. And local governments and state governments have really stepped up right now in dealing with COVID, dealing with fires and, local emergencies. Communities all have to come together, and perhaps, through a group, working with groups like Brookings, where I'm based, with groups like yourselves at the LA World Affairs Councils, with universities, with local libraries and local civic organizations, we can start to come together and to do something together. Because as consequential as this election is, it's not just going to be solved by a change of one guy on top or one political party. I mean, it's really incumbent on all of us now to do something. We all have agency, we can all do something. And that's really kind of what I'm thinking about now, is how that I, as an American citizen, can do more, from the grassroots or from the organizations, institutions that I'm involved in, to, get us back into action and to figuring out how we can put ourselves back together. And the more that we can pull together, the less, getting back to where we started, that Russia or anybody else can interfere in our democracy or in our very important activity at home.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hill. And I hope you will come out and see us in Southern California when your book comes out. And hopefully we can see you in person rather than from all of our homes, as you pointed out. So thank you so much, Bob. I'm going to turn the conversation back over to you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Jessica, as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica, for all the fine work you've been doing. Just one footnote to what you just said, Fiona. I think one of the components, small but important, in doing what you're talking about is getting a lot more congressional races that are competitive. And that involves somehow going back and undoing much of the gerrymandering that we've done in the recent past decade or two. If we were only do that, that's one decent step toward the objectives I think that you set.
Yeah, and I think also, Bob, I mean, which is hard to do, but we're all thinking about this all the time. When you make it competitive, it's how to lower the barriers for more people to run for congressional office. I mean, it costs so much money now I mean, with the Supreme Court ruling, that money is a, form of expression of freedom of speech, it's really kind of raised the barrier for people who might be extraordinarily good representatives for constituencies. If you can't raise, $5 million, say, you can't enter the race. And we need to really think very strongly about that, because we're putting, I think, too high a threshold for political and civic participation out there.
That's clearly a part of the problem. I just wanted to note that we had a wonderful program yesterday with General John Allen, who is president of Brookings. You've been a wonderful Brookings scholar for quite a few years. And when he assumed the presidency, one of the things he did in nudging the direction in which Brookings scholars and studying processes were to go was to create an emphasis on the middle class. And it sounded to me a lot like that your upcoming book, There Is Nothing for You Here, is going to fit in well into that emphasis that John has established at Brookings. So we all look forward to being able to read the full book, There Is Nothing for You Here, and hope that we can advance order it before too long. But thank you very much for your being here with us today and all the wonderful ideas that you communicated to all of us that were listening. I want to turn the program back over to our wonderful president, Kim.
Yeah, and thank you, Kim and Bob and Jessica, and to everybody else who's been participating. I mean, I'm just really delighted to be able to do this, really. Thank you.
Dr. Hill, we definitely want you back. This was such a critically important and sobering discussion. Bob, fabulous questions and moderating. Thank you both for your time and your expertise. Thank you so very much. For our viewers out there, what a fabulous program. All this inside scoop and expertise. If you can help us keep these quality programs going, just simply type the word GIVE, G-I-V-E, to text it to this number, and please help us with your support. We have a terrific lineup of programs. Tomorrow, politics professor Dan Schnur will be talking about the importance of the swing voter. And then Monday, we're back with Bob Abernethy moderating Anne Marie Slaughter, who will be talking about redefining national security for a post-pandemic environment. On the next day, we've got Jill Lepore, the New Yorker staff writer, who will be educating us on analytics and predicting the future. And then on the 23rd, we have the impact of China's rise on the Southeast Asia. And we have next week, the week after that, a conversation with California Senator Alex, Secretary of State Alex Padilla. So please go to our website at lawac.org, register for events today, become a member and see all the great benefits of joining this organization, and please make a donation. Please, everybody, stay safe, stay informed, and we'll see you tomorrow. Thank you, Dr. Hill.